Some people might say this is a regress report, that a rise in the rule of tyrants and dictators and haters and racists means progress is paused, that democracy is in disarray or even in recession. But I am here to remind you and tell you that progress is not paused. Progress is not retreating or failing, as some in the commentariat would have you believe. It is not taking a lunch break or a siesta. It's not out for a smoke or a bite to eat or a nap or a long weekend. It is everywhere we look, in every town and village and city, and it will not be stopped, because it cannot be stopped, because we will not and must not stop. 4 years ago, 4 years ago, we all left Ottawa with one of the greatest successes of our 25-year history. We were just months away from the United Nations passage of the Sustainable Development Goals, including Goal 4, the standalone goal for education. It was an outcome that had been one of our highest priorities and the centerpiece of our first global campaign. You remember, free, not affordable education. Teachers who are well-trained, paid at the same level as similar professions, social dialogue with unions, the right to professional development, lifelong learning, and the inclusion of universal secondary education. After our victory, we could have all just gone home, right? I mean, once you have a robust goal and targets to a sustainable future, what could go wrong? Our job was done, right? Wrong. Over the last 4 years, we have been building momentum, solidarity, arguments, evidence, strategies, campaigns, and alliances. From Ottawa to Bangkok, we mapped out a multi-tiered strategy across numerous platforms at the global and regional level. Together with you all, we chose the places and spaces that positioned us, our ideas, our values, and our aims squarely at the point where we could have the most influence and impact. For example, we all know that students are more than test scores, and that education is more than what can be measured on these toxic tests. Today, at the global level, there are more people and institutions agreeing with us. But we remember that not too long ago, the most prominent voices on the world stage said education was simple, right? Reading and math and testing. But now there are credible voices saying every student deserves qualified and supported teachers, a broad, rich curriculum, and that we need to close the gender gap and invest in gender-sensitive pedagogies. Make sure that teachers and schools are free of violence and that they have adequate infrastructure. That education is one of the single most important investments for creating a sustainable and equitable future. The UN itself is an organization committed to these principles, as we will hear tomorrow when Guy Ryder speaks to us. His organization, the International Labour Organization, is the oldest in the UN, and it has been doing it for 100 years, since the Treaty of Versailles. Using platforms effectively is not new to labor. We are building upon work that others began, when our society was built and developed around values, not just interests. Trade unions as a pillar of democracy, trade unions as the defenders of our professions, defenders of human and trade union rights and equality. Speaking of equality, our work on Indigenous peoples' rights continues. Since the last Congress, we now have an EI newsletter on Indigenous peoples and education, which is disseminated biannually. EI member organizations participated in the 11th World Indigenous Conference in Education, which was preceded by an EI seminar on Indigenous peoples' rights to and through education. And let's remember that this year is the International Year of Indigenous Languages. That's right. At the 62nd session of the UN Commission on the Status of Women, EI delegates worked actively to ensure the experiences, needs, and rights of Indigenous people, women and girls, in different parts of the world were highlighted and included in that outcome document. And EI strongly advocated for a specific reference to Indigenous workers during the negotiation process since 2016 for a new and very important ILO convention and recommendation on violence and harassment in the world of work, which we are happy to say was adopted by the centennial session of the ILO Labor Conference in June. Our work in the area of gender equality continues to expand and deepen. In addition to UNCSW and our women's networks, we have opened new fronts against school-related gender-based violence, partnering with the UN Girls Education Initiative across Africa. And everyone, I believe, who joined us at the World Women's Conference in Marrakesh would agree that we have made a quantum leap forward in building union capacity to not only address patriarchal structures, but also to develop strategies for women leaders in navigating the labyrinth. Since we were last in Congress, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the recommendations on the status of the teaching profession. In 1966, the ILO and UNESCO, both part of the United Nations, defined teaching that from a global platform for all the world to see. They defined it as a profession with professional standards established with the participation of teachers' organizations and recognizing their political and economic rights. In 1997, recommendations were set for the status and rights of higher education personnel, and we celebrated that milestone at the Sorbonne. Together, these recommendations are instruments that create accountability for member states, and numerous organizations have made use of this process. UNESCO has been a great ally, and I want to thank them for being here, both UNESCO Bangkok and UNESCO Paris, because now education support personnel are on your radar. And we want to see similar recommendations to uplift and defend the rights of support personnel across sectors. We got early childhood teachers' rights recognized in the ILO guidelines that are continuing to be adopted across regions, and now we're working on greater support for VET, a sector that I should say is singled out by many as the future for sustainable development, but continuously mined for profit by corporate pirates. I mean, all of this was part of our Education for All vision, and we were all in ensuring that we were part of the monitoring of government's performance on implementation. We had a presence at every regional body that was setting the plans. We took our representation seriously on the steering committee alongside of other organizations, and we've tracked the indicators that I mentioned earlier. We put resources into it. You now have the Better Bargain Handbook about how to engage with the SDG follow-up process, and you got and used our indicators guide to tracking and monitoring the implementation, how to meet with your governments to ensure that we have a voice and that that voice must be heard, because at the end of the day, where we work is where all of this comes together. It's very important to note here, last week at the United Nations, we released our report. The President released our report on the progress of the SDGs. It's called Off Track, and I'm going to address that more in a minute. But we also decided that the climate action agenda, the Paris Agreement, was too important to let go. The evidence from the UN panel on climate change research shows that inaction is not an option. And I believe we all agree Susan gave us a sobering overview of that yesterday. EI member unions are doing a lot on this front already, with their own governments in terms of schools. At the global level, we made sure your voice was heard. Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, UNESCO Sustainable Development Schools Network, demonstrations around the world led by students and teachers. September 20th has been called as the day for a global climate strike and has been endorsed by the ITUC and the broader labor movement. Colleagues, we have just a few years to reverse course, and together with our students, our colleagues, we must organize and pressure governments to act. Just last week, we published a guide for affiliates to engage members on climate change. The guide specifically discusses the role our unions can play in educating our members and helping to mobilize our communities. But more than that, the document shows us the best of what we know, that education is a powerful tool to combat climate change, and that that tool is in our hands. But the UN is not our only platform. The OECD continues to be a platform where bad ideas can spread as fast as good ones, and we need to keep the OECD honest. We need to stay engaged. We have held 8 international summits on the teaching profession, where we started with it being about teacher evaluation, and we've ended with it being about teacher well-being. We've moved the ministries of education in the OECD. We've added items to its surveys around teacher well-being, stress, and burnout. And obviously, there's still a lot of work to be done. But we are among the biggest global union federations influencing the OECD, not just in education and policy, but more broadly. Colleagues, we need to make sure that technology flows from pedagogy and not vice versa. At our last Congress, we also updated our statement on Palestine and Israel to reflect recent developments, and a high-level delegation met with leaders of EI member organizations in the region. One issue that remains important for member organizations is that curricula are not contributing to solving the conflict, and we still have work to do there. EI will stay committed to ensure that education unions in the region continue to work for peace and human rights. The other platform that we spent a lot of time developing and building representation space and areas for action activity is through the Global Partnership for Education, the GPE. And yes, it's housed within the World Bank. And we are all too familiar with the World Bank's agenda over the years and its actions. But we have never been afraid or timid in calling it out in the past, and that will not change in the future. In earlier times, teachers did not have a seat at the table in the GPE. We were part of a civil society NGO group, some of whom are here, but we did not have a discrete seat, and we fought very hard for that seat. Yet, we realized that our member organizations in GPE countries who now had a right to define the priorities and plans and projects of the aid that flows into their countries, we still didn't really know how to do that. So, in one sense, we won the space, but we still hadn't been able to make use of it until now. In the last 4 years, we've had unions from 15 countries and GPE countries that have gone through our policy dialogue process, where they now understand that they have a right to be part of a local education group and linked to a global teachers union constituency. They've done their own Education for All assessment. They've done their own education sector analysis. They are at the table, and time again, when applications for grants have come to the GPE board, if our members weren't involved, we've pushed them back and said no. And you may have heard about attempts by right-wing governments to transfer taxpayer money, the funds of GPE, to for-profit actors. And we've had some major successes in this space. But colleagues, the threat is never too far away. We will remain vigilant because there are always dangers ahead. So we use the platforms that are there. OECD, 50 countries, GPE, 87 countries. We cannot and will not vacate this space. These are places where we can influence policy, sometimes set guidelines and monitor compliance. And we can still turn out people to make our voices heard. They advise and we question and push because we know what's going on out there. We are no longer in the dark. In the beginning, we had no idea. It was just a big cloud of alphabet soup. We knew we didn't support most of what was going on at the time. We knew that there were interests that were often opposed to our own. We were great at making long speeches about them in the abstract, but we hadn't figured out how to do public sector supply chain back to the source of funding and conditionality. And now we use platforms strategically. We understand the influence points with governments and the timing, the leverage we can have, the arguments they use, and the research that they bring to support themselves. Oh, did I say research? Colleagues, our research has increased, but not just in terms of quantity, which it has massively, but in terms of quality. It's being taken up by major organizations. Governments are using it, referring to it, whether that's our inclusion report or whether that's our Status of the World Teachers report that we launched on World Teachers Day. That report contains voices from 140 EI member organizations and showed common challenges faced by teachers worldwide, including poor working conditions, precarious contracts, inadequate teaching tools, and high levels of stress. Two storms are coming together: the global teacher shortage and an oversupply of discouragement and disrespect that keeps too many from our profession entirely or for more than just a few years. And many of you participated in our consultations on quality terms of employment, and now you have the result of those consultations, that brief in your documents. The work is very hard, but let's look at some of the details because they're important. Since 2015, all of us together have engaged at the highest levels to understand where we are with regards to SDG 4. And last week at the high-level meeting at the United Nations, our president launched our SDG 4 assessment of progress. And we gave governments our assessment of the progress that they have made. And while there are more kids in school in some areas of the world, in 2017, 1 out of every 5 children, adolescents, and youth were still out of school. And the Global Education Monitoring Report just revealed a trend that should concern every one of us. Currently, there are 262 million school-aged children not in school. At current rates, if we keep making the same off-track progress we are making today, by 2030, that number will only be reduced by 32 million kids. At this rate, we will have missed the target by 88%. Think about that. Domestic funding for education remains insufficient, and in too many cases, it has decreased since 2015, while privatization and commercialization of education have expanded and intensified. Globally, the involvement of unions in education policy development is too often lacking, while the status of the teaching profession is low and in some cases declining. The world needs 69 million additional teachers by 2030, and some governments prefer unqualified, non-unionized volunteers with scripts and tablets. We addressed governments directly, calling upon them to ensure a different outcome, to urgently step up investment in free, quality education and in the education workforce, to ensure rights in and through education, the rights of teachers and ESP, the rights of students, and education about our human rights and how we defend them. And we've been doing serious work to engage education support personnel. We had the first ever ESP Global Conference, and we launched World ESP Day on May 16th. It's the fastest growing sector in many of the organizations in this room, education support personnel. And the ESP task force has worked tirelessly over those last 4 years, identifying job categories, research priorities, advocacy targets, and outlining how they want to work together on advancing whole schools for the whole student. As part of our commitment to expand EI's work with ESP, we surveyed more than 3,000 ESP on every continent, and we found out who they are. Most are women between the ages of 40 and 60, and most are poorly paid. In Brazil, half of surveyed ESP have no job security. In France, the number is 64%. In the Philippines, 60%. Half of Quebec ESP say they have no role in workplace decisions. While some 80% of ESP in New Zealand feel that they make a big difference for teachers, the same percentage say that they have no opportunity for career advancement. 70% experience that same issue in Zimbabwe. And in the US, also nearly 70% of our ESP colleagues work without paid leave. These are the people on the front lines. These are some of the most underpaid, underappreciated people. So let us be very clear. We will advocate for our ESP colleagues across the board for job security, pay, and advancement. And we will work to make sure ESP knows their rights, and we will celebrate their roles in the workplace. And ESP will continue to be a priority here. Thank you for everything that you do. We've done research in higher education. We've looked at what a supportive environment is and what it looks like in higher education. We've done research looking at the ways in which publishing companies are impacting on academic freedom and professional autonomy. And we've created alliances through another platform, the World Intellectual Property Organization. It's another UN platform with partners, librarians, archivists, museums, and others, some of whom are with us today, to bring forward a conversation that is very long time in coming about the right to information, access to information. We know that those who can control and commodify information will use it to influence and persuade, and we cannot let them win. There are not alternative facts. We need the light of knowledge and information to be accessible to all, so that we can take the fight up to those dark forces we are fighting against. And that's why we are pushing for an international copyright treaty to increase access to education and research resources. And we've done a lot of research in terms of looking at trade deals and thinking about the ways in which global capital and corporations have been for far too long lobbying our governments and opening up all sorts of areas and setting in places ratchet clauses. And that means that if you liberalize a certain sector, you can never come back and tighten it up again. You can only move one way, like a ratchet. But colleagues, education is not a commodity. It is a right. So we ran a campaign about that. We launched our first ever guidebook for what teacher trade unionists need to know and care about trade deals. And we launched that in Brazil. Since we all came together in Ottawa, the issue of refugees and migrant rights have come to the fore at the global level. We understand our responsibility to defend the human and trade union rights of migrants and refugees in their destination countries. As a result of that, we came together in Stockholm, Sweden, for the Refugee Education Conference, and we left with commitments and action plans. EI is proud to lead a project about creating refugee-welcoming schools with unions across Europe that have come up with innovative approaches and they've partnered from Bremen to Naples to Madrid about how to not just welcome students into their schools, but also how do we think about the qualifications of those teachers and those newly arrived professionals, our brothers and sisters. If a Syrian refugee is in your town as a teacher, they need to have full union rights. They need to be on a pathway to full accreditation so that their skills can be used. We don't want them to be driven out of our schools. We want them driving ideas. We want them driving change as members of our unions. And EI was really proud to join with member organizations on both sides of the Mexican-American border in submitting a complaint to the UN Human Rights Council regarding the Trump administration's incarceration of asylum-seeking children on the border with Mexico. I joined a delegation there last summer, yes. And we took part in a demonstration a few weeks ago in Geneva. But colleagues, children have died in those camps. Yeah. We cannot ignore the inhumanity and the rights abuses happening along the borders the world over. From Mexico to the Rohingya and the Uyghurs, Syrian refugees displaced by war, to those trapped in never-ending conflicts like our brothers and sisters in Yemen. We must also not sit silently by while members are targeted and killed in Burkina, in Chad, Mali, Niger, Nigeria, countries where political and terrorist violence has taken the lives of teachers, academic, and education support personnel alike. But let me return to Brazil. Lula is still in jail. And there's another right-wing misogynist, xenophobic, neo-fascist named Bolsonaro. He was just elected president. We know for a fact that the prosecutor and judge conspired to jail him with scant evidence. It was a source of great pride being part of an EI Latin American delegation in Brazil, shoulder to shoulder with members demanding that Lula, who is being unjustly held, be freed. He's a political prisoner. And when we were there, we said the next time we come back to Curitiba, we want it to be a monument like Robben Island. Colleagues, Lula libre. Qué lindo que son, eh? We'll send this to Bolsonaro. But do you know that shortly after his inauguration, Bolsonaro, his Minister of Education, he sent out an edict to all the heads of schools across Brazil to tape their students repeating the right-wing authoritarians' campaign motto, and then have those tapes sent back to the Ministry of Education. But what did they do? Oh, they taped. They taped thousands of themselves. They taped themselves dancing samba. And they sent those tapes back to the Ministry of Education. And then the union came in behind them, pointed out the inconstitutionality of that, and thanks to your actions and your work in the court, they were forced to reverse it and rescind the order within 3 days of issuing it. Comrades, colleagues, we can win. But the same thing is also happening in Germany. Right-wing AfD politicians urging the videotaping of teachers. But we are standing up to this. We're tracking it, and we're issuing urgent action appeals and responding quickly. But meanwhile, Bolsonaro is actually talking about making a new national holiday, commemorating the military junta that ousted democracy and installed a military dictatorship. So let's talk about democracy. These are dark times for democracy. I mean, it was unthinkable that a racist, demagogue, and accused criminal conspirator who is just trying to launch a television network on the back of a presidential campaign could lose the popular vote and still win. And in the United States, in the states that voted for Trump, we have seen an unprecedented increase in xenophobia and bullying in schools. There is an assault on our profession. And there's their Secretary of Education, a billionaire with zero experience in public education, who came to office as the nation's leading campaigner to shift public money to private schools. And she still is. It's a time of unprecedented courage and organizational might in the U.S. teachers' unions, and particularly the Red for Ed movement of strikes in places where they never thought it was possible. Am I right? In the Philippines, our brave board member, Raymond Basilio, had to go into hiding because of Duterte and his thugs who wanted him to be silenced. And they threatened him, and they detained and harassed our members who dared to bring resources and support to an indigenous group of people who the government called a terrorist organization, women and children in a rural area. And we are so happy that they have been freed and that the Arthur Svensson Award this year, which is the Nobel Prize for the trade union movement, went to our very own ACT Franz Castro, who will be with us later this week and speaking to us. But colleagues, we will not let up. Right before this Congress, on your behalf, I co-led with BWI a Council of Global Unions delegation in the Philippines, meeting with government, unions, and the Human Rights Council. We are putting them under a microscope. And we are so honored that Maria Ressa, the amazing, brave Filipina journalist who is Time Magazine's Person of the Year, will be here to talk to us about the necessary alliance between journalists and education workers and teachers to defend democracy and the freedom of expression. In Turkey, Erdogan continues to target our members, and we continue to press for justice in the courts and with the ILO. And what you should know is that we are still fighting for the release of many teacher trade union leaders. We are still fighting for the reinstatement of teachers who were dismissed for political reasons. Their only offense was to sign a petition calling for peace. And we will have a petition calling for their release. We'll have a big sign up. So on Thursday during the awards reception in the back, make sure that you sign that, please. But over the past 4 years, we have launched 37 calls for urgent action. And please know that if we issue it, it's because it is in fact urgent. We need you to demonstrate your solidarity. Sending a letter to the relevant authorities is not too much to ask, particularly when we know what a difference it makes, particularly when we can see the results in our freed colleagues. Colleagues, this is why our President and Emeritus General Secretary have written the 25 Lessons on Education and Democracy for our 25th anniversary. The book has been published, the poster has been shared and translated, and we're launching actually the book in Congress tomorrow. I encourage you all to get an autographed copy from Fred and Susan at the reception following the awards ceremony Thursday evening. But let me read to you briefly from the foreword, because Timothy Snyder, who's a good friend of EI, who wrote On Tyranny, wrote it, and he said, "Democracy depends upon a common world that we can all try to understand together. If the people are to rule, which is what democracy means, the people must see and grasp and share and improve the world around them. All of this is possible, but none of it is automatic. Such a world can only be made by teachers and the schools and the unions that support them. Clearly, we need to take greater action in terms of defending democracy. We have a resolution on EI taking the lead on democracy, and we need to take the lead. We must be the protectors of democracy because no one else is going to address this at the level we can. In the classrooms, in the union halls, in the communities, in the parliament houses, on the streets, and at the global level, we must build alliances and we must organize. For far too long, we have watched everyone but ourselves set standards for our profession, or shall I say, remove standards from our profession. Corporate, profit-making actors suggesting that anybody can be a teacher, trying to turn us into basic content delivery machines with just a few weeks of training. A non-professional who is easy to evaluate, monitor, digitize, and control. And we have resisted it every step of the way, but we're doing more of that. All of us in this room are in favor of labor standards, correct? Yeah? We're all in favor of environmental standards because our existence depends upon it. We're all in favor of equality standards. Our values demand it. So why wouldn't we be in favor of professional standards? That's why we're going to be discussing here the global framework on professional teaching standards. EI member organizations can set the bar for our profession, our membership, to negotiate and set those for yourselves. Because we are not automatons. We are not robots. We know our students. We know our communities, and we need to be able to say and set the entrance requirements, and also the requirements around our professional ethics and practice for what it means to be a teacher at this moment in time. And yes, I know there's some discussion on that. This is our profession, and defending our status is our core business. Because if we don't lead this work, you can rest assured there are other forces who would like to represent teachers, who are much more amenable to corporate leaders and right-wing governments. They would be more than happy to push us right out of the way at the local, national, regional, global level. And this is especially true in developing countries, where many of the unions in this room are fighting to have a say in what it actually means to be a teacher. And whether that's a World Bank-backed corporate NGO that now has its tentacles in almost 50 countries, or a host of other NGOs popping up, we must draw the line and lift the bar. No doubt if they are successful and teaching becomes recast as temporary charity work, your ability to be the voice of the profession at the national level will be easier to ignore. What they are really doing is working government by government to tear apart and tear up existing regulations, to rip apart and deregulate qualifications and licensing systems, to make it easier for cheaper teachers, non-unionized teachers, to pave the way for the digitization of education and robot teachers. Colleagues, we are not going to let them do it, are we? No. In 2017, we held our Quality Education and Leadership Conference in Rotterdam, bringing together 300 participants from 70 countries and thousands more via social media. We focused on 4 streams: professionalism, pedagogy, curriculum, and leadership. It was an incredible platform for teacher union leaders and partners to share learning and leadership initiatives on professionalism, the application of new technologies, and the development of meaningful criteria. And the conference also helped us maintain momentum on achieving the Sustainable Development Goal 4 in particular. And it was there that we united around key principles: that governments have the responsibility to recruit qualified teachers, provide initial education and training, as well as continuous professional development of a high quality to all teachers, and that we as unionists would keep professional practice at the core of education unions' activities and actions and take the lead. There's that phrase. In designing and promoting progressive approaches to collaborative professional teacher development. Take the lead. 4 years ago, World Congress came together to face a crisis: the growing commercialization and privatization of education. We said, in effect, we can no longer just describe the water that we're all drowning in and complain to each other. It can't simply be group therapy when we all come together and talk about how terrible it is that certain families or groups or corporations begin to consume entire public education systems. We had to organize. And so our global response campaign was launched. And our credentials as an activist global union federation have been clearly on display over these last 4 years. The Global Response Campaign has established a footprint, driving the campaign against the growing privatization and commercialization of education with member organizations in countries in nearly every region and sub-region. A direct campaign presence is now evident in Uganda, in Kenya, in Morocco, in Nigeria, Liberia, Cote d'Ivoire, Philippines, India, Nepal, the Pacific, Brazil, Uruguay, Peru, Argentina, Honduras, and now Greece. We are taking on the zealotry of market fundamentalism. And we're doing it because it undermines quality education, the rights of students, and the rights of our profession. We defend and promote the rights of all, not just the few. We will not sit idly by and allow the creation of markets, a system of winners and losers. We will not sit idly by to have our schools and colleges turned over to for-profit, private actors who discriminate against qualified teachers, the poor, the marginalized, girls, and those with disabilities, who may be too expensive to teach and just aren't part of their business plan. We will not let this happen. And 4 years ago, we decided that Pearson, that's right, Pearson was a target. And we have delivered a number of actions to expose what Pearson is doing. Its latest business plans with the digitalization of education, the potential negative impact of artificial intelligence on student privacy and teachers' professionalism, that was the subject of our latest action. And in higher education, we said publishing companies that are creating an undemocratic system in terms of access to information, basically an extraction system where they exploit our higher education professionals, taking their autonomy and their value, because these professionals are in the way of their profits. And that's why we're targeting Elsevier for commodifying the work of academics and researchers the world over. And in terms of the Global South, we decided to go after the biggest for-profit scripted curriculum on a tablet attack on students and the profession the world has ever seen. Bridge International Academies. They're not schools, colleagues. They are corporate vultures seeking to exploit the aspirations of poor children and their families. They are illegal operators supported by Pearson, the World Bank, and others. And this was somewhat new territory for us, folks. We weren't used to getting so many angry letters, threats of legal action, getting sued, having our researchers arrested. But we prevailed. In Uganda and Kenya, Bridge International Academies were declared illegal. In Uruguay, that's right. Give yourselves a hand. In Uruguay, we were there in the streets. The Defense of Public Education features now in their Mardi Gras parade. In the Philippines, another Pearson corporate venture called APEC has been subjected to parliamentary inquiries. And when that's not been good enough, the Parliament of the Street. That's right. Our campaign continues to be underpinned by research, communication, and solidarity. Colleagues, we will prevail. And we will do so by continuing to build an EI where the whole is greater than the sum of our individual parts. Colleagues, these are our fights, and we can win these fights. We can show that we can win these fights if we're aligned, if we're working with solidarity in our blood, if we're working with purpose in our hearts, and if we're working with commitment in our minds to achieve great things. It's a complex moment, no question. It's a dark moment, no question. But it is a moment where there is a leadership vacuum at the global, national, and local level. If only there was a profession who could help students and societies make sense of this complexity. If only there were a profession that combined the knowledge we have constructed across disciplines and centuries with the ethical values that inform the use of that knowledge. Oh, if only there were a profession committed to deeply understanding and supporting human development, well-being, and learning, one that is deeply curious and had research and collaborative problem solving hardwired into its DNA. If only there were a profession that could bring together local ways of knowing and cultural practices with global understanding and awareness of universal rights. Open-minded, open source. If only there were a profession rooted in every community in the world. Imagine the power of its practitioners. Imagine if they were also active, trusted, and influential members of those very same communities. Woof. Such a profession might be able to actually bridge the possible with the desirable and lead informed debates using facts and information. Of course, the emergence of such a profession onto the current scene would immediately draw the ire, the anger of those who benefit from inequality, unconscious consumption, insecurity, fear, ignorance, mistrust, and, well, a globally rigged system. Such a profession would need to have its own democratic structures and independence to assert its influence, rights, value, as it bravely shines its lights into the encroaching darkness and defends the vulnerable. Such a profession would need to count on solidarity at its core, as it would never be able to purchase the influence and tools that would be marshaled against it. Such a profession would require a union of purpose that defends its autonomy and its rights in law and in practice. If only there was a profession that organized locally, nationally, regionally, and internationally to inspire and empower. Such an organized, respected, and principled profession might be able to chart a different course, construct a different architecture, and maybe even elevate fairness and decency as global priorities. Colleagues, the time for strong men, technical advisors, neoliberal privatizing entrepreneurs, fearmongers, nativists, market fundamentalists, demagogues, narcissists, and managerialists must be brought to a close because we are the ones that we've been waiting for. We braid the knowledge of our profession with the strength of our trade union movement and the conviction of our social justice ideals. We are much more than knowledge workers. We are organized wisdom workers. We speak all languages. We bear witness to all atrocities and accomplishments, and we defend the truth. Collectively, we seek a better, more just bargain for our societies, our schools, and our students. I wish you all the best as you engage in deliberations, set priorities, and chart a course for our global union over these next few days. What happens next, how we build power, navigate complexity, and fend off the democratic assaults can best be posited by beginning with a single but oh so powerful word: we, nous, nosotros, wir. Thank you.